Hello class. I have in front of me a spreadsheet that I'm going to use to demonstrate how we can calculate various types of numbers within the process accounting phase. As I mentioned in our class today, there are a number of things that you need to know how to compute within this chapter. You need to first know how to determine the number of units to be accounted for. You need to use that information to compute the equivalent units. Then you need to use information also from this activity to compute the cost per unit. And then you'll also need to know how to journalize transactions. So what I want to do in this particular tutorial is to show you, based on some data that you're given, how to use that data and how to format it in such a way that you can compute what the units that you need to account for, and also use that information to compute the cost per equivalent unit based on materials and based on process. So given this information here for the Grammar Chicken Company, they produce chicken a la king. It's in a can. They have 3 different departments, and each of the departments we're going to be determining what the equivalent units are based on some data. So let's get looking at the data that we have. For November, we have beginning inventory, and again on one side of the screen here, as you can see that I'm highlighting, it's going to be in the form of units, in this case gallons, and then the other side will be in the form of dollars. And you're going to need both, but depending on what type of question being asked. So what we're going to do is try to determine what information we need, use that information to provide us with the equivalent units. So right now we want to find the flow of units. That's the first step. We want to be able to compute the equivalent units, but we first need to know the total number of units that flowed in and each unit for the organization. So first thing we need to know is the total units to account for. We want to start by determining if there's a beginning balance. And in this case, we don't have one, but I want to just use the spreadsheet to fill in information, because there are sometimes where you have beginning balances or beginning WIP balances, and sometimes you don't. So in this case, we don't have any, but we have also found out that we had some units that were started in production. Which I get from right here, 14,300 gallons. Now, don't misunderstand, we're not going to ignore the information that we have on the other side, which is the total cost, okay? We're going to deal with that in a moment, but right now, let's first get the units together. So far we have 14,300 units, and it doesn't seem to show we have any beginning inventory. So right now, our physical units we are accounting for is 14,300 if nothing else occurs. But we also have to consider units completed and transferred out. And in this case, it's going to be 13,600. Now, we want to know what our ending WIP is. Well, our ending WIP is given to us. We can also calculate it, but our ending WIP, oopsie, our ending WIP, I'm going to go back to my cell, ending WIP, which in this case is what, 60% done? And that's 700 gallons. And you can see that the total units that we are accounting for in total is 14,300. Okay? Now, the next step then is how do we determine our equivalent units based on the different departments? And in these cases, we just want to make certain we gather the correct information. So what do we want to put in these cells? Well, it really does depend. What we're going to do is we're looking at the information over here. And I want you to get familiar with this, because you're going to see a lot of different types of charts, and it becomes important to know what information you need to use at the moment you're using it. I mean, all of this information will be absolutely essential, but the problem is it becomes overwhelming when you look at them in total. We want to be able to find out what information is useful to us. And since we're focusing on, at this point, units and calculating equivalent units, we're going to be directing most of our attention right here. Okay. So now that we know that, let's go back over to the spreadsheet. Remember, you can do this on a regular sheet of paper. I just want to do it this way because it really makes it a little bit easier for me to go step by step and not be impaired by my writing and all of that. So what we want to do in this one section is compute the equivalent units, and they are going to be in 3 different categories. Okay, so we now know the flow of units. So now let's think about what we have to think about is what are we going to be using as equivalent units for each department. And I'm going to put in here 13,600. Those are the units that we're going to be talking about here. For each one, that's going to be the equivalent units completed and transferred out. Now, for the chicken or the WIP process, the WIP, which is right here, which is not completed, we want to be able to find out what is going to be the equivalent units as it relates to the different component units here. So now we want to deal with this WIP, 60% complete. So it is in the mixing process, which right here is the mixing process. So we're going to put in the units that are still not complete under that that category. But we also want to deal with the conversion costs associated with it. And if we're at 60%, we want to take 60% of that number to come up with our conversion costs. And I'm just going to do my little calculation. The most important thing here is knowing what the numbers are and why they are important. Okay, let me re-add. Okay, so let's think about what we're doing here. So first of all, we know 14,300 units are the units that we're going to account for. And we want to follow these units into the respective processes. We know the mixing process is right here, and 700 units are in process to be moved over and combined is still 700 units. So we know 700 units is still in the mixing process. We want to calculate the conversion or the conversion cost associated with it. We know 60% is our ratio. So we're going to take and multiply the 700 units that's still in process times the 60% to come up with our conversion costs. So now we can determine, based on this information, what are the equivalent units of production for these different areas. So in recap, the first thing we want to do is determine the flow of units. The flow of units in this example comprise of the units that we have put in production, the units that we have completed, and the units that we're still working on. That's the total amount. So this is what number we're going to be tying to, really. Now, of those units, we want to take and break them out because we want to make certain that the different departments have, or different processes have the units associated with. We want equivalent units by area process. So the completed and transfer out is pretty straightforward. It's the 13,600. What we want to think about is what the WIP is, and then how do we compute the conversion costs associated with the ones that are not done yet. And we're going to use the 60% of what's left. What's left to be completed or less to be worked on is 700 units, and it's only 60% complete. So we want to use that 60% and calculating the conversion cost, considering only 60% is still is complete at this point. Using that, now we can say, okay, for each one of the processes, we know exactly what the equivalent units are. We have not only included our completed and transferred, but we included our WIP. And our WIP, we are going to be calculating a fraction of it. What is the fraction? The fraction that it is complete. So for each one of these items, we have to, for our chicken and cream process, 14,000 equivalent units. Green peppers and mushrooms, again, 13,600, because the WIP has not reached this area yet. Then we have our conversion cost of 14,000, which includes the completed and transferred and a portion of the work in process, or 60%. Using that information, now let's direct our attention over to the little worksheet here. We were working on this side of it, but now we have the equivalent units, and we are aware of the total units to be accounted for. we can now turn our attention to the actual dollar amounts and utilize that information to make some more calculations. So one, we've calculated the total flow of units, or the units to be accounted for. Number two, we've calculated, very simply, the equivalent units. Now we're going to take this information and we're going to compute the equivalent units, the cost per equivalent unit. Now, before we do that, let's think about how this information works together. When you're trying to determine how well or how far along your cost process is, it's important to know what your ending inventory is and how far along in that process, because that's the number really we're going to be basically computing, because the other numbers basically are given to us. The only real computation is computing the conversion costs associated with WIP and adding those two numbers together to come to our equivalent units. So not much calculation is done. It's really taking the information that you've noticed here and placing them in the correct format so that we can actually see these are the number of units that we have, the flow of units that we have, and then here are the categories that these units apply to, and here is how we're going to handle the work in process. And again, when it comes to conversion costs, we have to consider the amount of that process that is complete, which is in this case 60%. So the real calculation really is just right here at the 60%, multiplying it by the work in process ending inventory. That's the real calculation. Everything else is basically inside the workbox. Now, let's go to the next step. Next, we are going to compute the cost per equivalent unit. But before we compute that, we need to utilize the dollar amounts on our worksheet. And what I've done here is I completed here, I said beginning work in process. And as far as I know, we have no beginning work in process, so we can easily just put a 0 here. Now, costs added during the month. According to the spreadsheet here, let's look at that. I'm going to go back to the little spread, and it gives me costs added during the month, but it gives it to me in different categories. So chicken and cream are going to be together. So I'm going to take and add chicken plus the cream. So I come up with the first calculation is the cost added. I'm sorry, I'm going to change this here. Put a 0 here. And I'm going to put it in the right cell so that you can follow me. But in the end, I'm going to add the two together because they're being costed together, the chicken and the cream. So far, pretty straightforward. The same thing I'm going to do for mushrooms. Mushrooms I see on my spreadsheet here is $5,440. So I'm going to add that to costs added during the month. And then the conversion cost then, and as we already talked about, conversion costs are as a combination of our direct labor and our manufacturing overhead. So I'm going to take the direct labor and add it, and the manufacturing overhead and add it to get my number. I'm going to just do a calculation to copy my cells here. Okay, so, and I don't know why it's giving me such strange number, but nevertheless, we're going to go with that. So now it's not a matter of anything unusual. We just have to be able to read the spreadsheet or read the question very carefully and know where to get the answers. So we are going to add our costs added through the month. So we had those. Now I'm going to run a total, and that's going to give me my total cost to account for. And here we are. We have our 25,000 for our 25,700. Our green peppers and mushrooms are 5,000 and 21,000 for our conversion costs. Now, that's an important step, and I want to stop right here for us to think about what we've just done before proceeding to the next step. Our next step then is to compute the total equivalent units. Well, we did that already. So where is the information then? The information is located right here. So for our chicken and cream, we have 14,300 as our equivalent units, and I'm going to put that number right in the cell. We've already computed our green peppers and mushrooms equivalent units, so I'm going to take the number coming straight from here. And we already computed our conversion cost, which is our $14,020. So far, so good. And this information is important because it's going to definitely affect our cost per equivalent unit. Now, we already have our total costs to account for. We already have our equivalent units. Now we're in a position to compute our cost per equivalent unit. How do we do that? Well, we're going to do a division, basically. We're going to have to divide these numbers through. So let's wait a second. Let's think about what we've done before proceeding to the next step. So now all we need to do is do our division. And what we're dividing is we're going to divide our total cost to account for by the equivalent units that we've already calculated to come up with our cost per equivalent unit. And I'm going to do the same thing here. I'm going to take my total cost to account for and divide it by my equivalent units. I get 40 cents and do the same thing here. I'm going to take the 21,000 and I'm going to divide by the 14, which is my total equivalent units. So far, so good. So let me highlight these and go through these steps once more. In this process, we have to first compute our equivalent units. In doing so, we determine the flow of the units. That's important because that's going to give us where the total number of units that we have to account for. Okay, it's very important to know what we're accounting for before we compute the equivalent units. It's a very, very important step. And then as we were computing that, one thing to note was, how do we handle work in process? Work in process, we're going to deal with that because we have to deal with the conversion costs associated with it, which has yet to be applied in the case of the units have not been completed. Obviously, the units have been completed. We've already got the costs associated with that, but now we have to deal with the ones that are not done. They're almost done. So in doing so, we had to compute a portion of our WIP based on the 60% complete to come up to our now conversion cost to give us a final calculation of our equivalent units. Now that we know our equivalent units, we went back over to this section here because we were using one side of it on the unit side. Now we got to take in consideration our numbers, our dollar values associated with these processes. So on this side, we were able to take our beginning WIP, which we know is 0. We added our costs, which is told us in dollars, our costs that were added in dollars for each category, and we placed it here. And then we had to deal with our total accounted for. And that total accounted for is going to be our beginning WIP plus the costs that we've added during the month. That's the basic calculation. Once we've got that information, I'm going to highlight it because that's just a very basic calculation. It's just taking our beginning WIP plus our costs added during the month. Then we have our equivalent units. Now, we've already calculated our equivalent units right here. So the question then becomes, all we need to do is take these numbers and plug them right here. Once we plug in our equivalent units that we've already calculated, we now are in a better position to calculate our cost per equivalent unit. Now, I'm going to take this process a little further, but before I do so, in the next video, I want you to just remember, follow the steps very, very carefully and take your time. In order to compute your equivalent units, you must know the total number of units to account for. Once you know the units to account for, you have to consider the work in process because that's going to give you the heads up. That's going to give you the final key, I would say, to computing the equivalent units for those different areas. Then once you have your equivalent units, you're going to be using dollars at this point because now you're going to take what you've actually spent, the cost associated with it. Again, using our beginning WIP, which in this case we don't have any, adding the costs associated with each one of the processes and adding the two together. That gives you your total cost to account for. So beginning WIP plus your costs added during the month equals your total cost to account for. And it's a very important calculation. It's very simple, but it's important to note that's all you need. So if they're asking you for total cost to account for, I truly believe the simplest way to look at it is just as this: WIP plus cost added. And we're using dollars at this point. Now, we want to at the next point, calculate our equivalent cost per equivalent unit. Well, we know to find out what that number is, we have to divide the cost to account for by our equivalent units. And once we plugged in our 14,000, 13,006 and our 14,020 units, we were now able to compute what each unit would cost them. and it's based on a different process. And we can even take this number further and add them to come up with our total cost to produce that item, which is $3.70. It didn't ask you that question, but I was just giving you another way to look at it in total and individually. In our next video, I'm going to go over how to create journal entries using various different types of processes within an organization. And I'm going to go over how do we put all this information together and determine, if we can, what the work in process ending inventory balance is, or work in process account balance is. So hopefully this particular video is helpful to you. And let me know if there's anything I could do to help you understand these 4 steps.